Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. It's your local community radio station you are tuned to, and we are broadcasting on Yagara and Turrbal country. And it's great to be back for another year. We'll keep on trying to have conversations on this show that aren't happening elsewhere about what's the state of this world, what's wrong with it, and what can we do to make it better. And, well, while some of us were hoping to have a nice break over New Year's and just relax for a bit, hanging out with people we love, around the world, just the madness of our days continued. And as you've probably heard, there was a military coup in Venezuela, carried out, this time shamelessly, by the US. Have, of course, been involved behind the scenes in different coups in Latin America over the years, and one attempted one in Venezuela a couple of decades ago. But this time overtly used their military to take over a government and abduct the president. A president who it is questionable whether he is the democratically elected president of Venezuela, as we will hear in this interview. But all the same, it is not the US's place to come in and abduct him and charge him with crimes that it's not at all clear what they are, but to just brutally take the power. But that is the world we're living in at the moment, and unfortunately it looks a lot like the world that people have lived in for many, many years, where power is the name of the game. Surely it's not the way it has to be, but that's up to us, isn't it, to make a better world. So today on the show, I speak with Federico Fuentes, who is an Australian-based writer who has spent time living in Venezuela, and a lot of his writing is focused on that country, interviewing people there who are working for a better Venezuela amongst all the problems that it has had in recent times. And he has, of course, been following the events of the last week closely. And so I chat with him about that, about what has happened, what's going on behind the scenes, I guess, while this happens. But then we also take some time to talk about what happened to the Bolivarian revolution, the great hope of the socialist left around the world in the first part of this century, the Hugo Chavez's populist left-wing movement that seemed to offer so much for equality and democracy in Venezuela, but something went wrong along the way, and you ended up with an authoritarian government and now a US puppet regime, I guess, while they work out what is next for that country. And so I had a long chat with Federico, and he's going to take up the show today, and he'll explain all these things much better than I can, so let's get into it.
Hi, my name is Federico Fuentes. I've been a long-time follower and observer of politics in Venezuela, both as a reporter for Green Left Weekly, as well as having worked in Caracas for a number of years in the Miranda International Center, which was a think tank aligned with the Ministry of Higher Education there in Venezuela. I was there during the period of 2007-2010, and before and subsequent to that, travelled quite a few times to Venezuela, so I've had both personal experiences, a lot of contacts there in Venezuela, and continuing to observe events there from afar now.
Yes, well, it's not very often that Venezuela makes Australian news generally, but it certainly has in the last week. And so, because some people might not have heard, or there might be some confusion around it, can you just fill us in on what has happened in the last week in Venezuela?
Yeah, well, the events of the last week have been extremely dramatic, really. And I think, it has to be said, represent a very dangerous turning point, not just for politics, obviously, in Venezuela, but I think internationally, where we've seen, the very brazen sort of operation that the US government has carried out of essentially kidnapping the head of state and his wife, who was a National Assembly parliamentarian. So that's Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores, and taking them out of the country in a military assault operation that involved the bombing of several military sites and other sites as well, not just military sites in and around the capital city and some nearby cities, taking them out of the country. Now, of course, that comes after several months now of a huge military build-up in the Caribbean, where we've seen the US sort of, trying to very much project its military power across the region, and sort of reasserting, or the Trump administration reasserting the fact that it sees this area as its backyard, and is no longer even going to bother with the pretense of multilateralism, of discourse, of spreading democracy, but make it open that it's got the military power. This is its area. It's going to decide what happens. And so it's been doing everything from carrying out extrajudicial killings through the bombings of boats in the Caribbean and in the Pacific Ocean on the other side of Central America, through to, as we saw now, the kidnapping of a president, and with Trump making it clear that this is just the beginning, that they certainly envisage the possibility of further actions, be that against military strikes in Colombia or Mexico, which are two things they've talked about, and they've certainly put the Cuban government on alert, saying that they may be also targets in the next few periods. So I think we are very much living some very dangerous times, and some very, very sort of deadly precedents are being set in terms of breakdown of international law.
And now there have been a few different justifications put forward by the Trump government. One being that Venezuela has resources which they want, which is quite honest. There's also these justifications about narco-terrorism and sending criminals to the US, which seem a bit more strange. Is there anything to these?
No, of course not. And in fact, like a lot of the government's administration's lies are very much falling apart. I mean, we've seen, for example, now, Maduro's been put on trial, and immediately the prosecution has dropped the charge that he was supposedly the head of some drug cartel called the Cartel del Sols, so the Cartel of Suns, now admitting that, basically it never existed to start with. But I think what we've seen over this period of time is that Trump first unleashes his sort of military deployment in around August, and had to find a justification, some way to sort of sell this to the broader US public. And what they've sought to do is by basically trying to bring together the war on drugs and the war on terror, two classic sort of campaigns that the US, previous US administrations have always sort of pursued to try to win support for military action, and brought them together to sort of say that Venezuela is kind of this sort of the coming together of this narco-terrorist sort of hub in South America. Of course, there's no evidence to prove any of this, and in fact, even the US government's own sort of published documents demonstrate that, for example, 94% of the drugs coming from South America to North America are actually exiting via the Pacific Ocean and not by the Caribbean or the Atlantic. And yet the deployment was primarily in the Caribbean and on the Atlantic side of Central America. As this sort of argument, I suppose, began to a bit unravel, what we saw was the sort of shift, and what we're seeing right now is just the open brazenness of sort of saying, actually, this is about Venezuela's oil. This is about who gets to control the resources in not just in Venezuela, but this is being projected as an example of what will happen for the region. And I think that's what the government has decided. It's decided that it doesn't necessarily have to worry anymore, or doesn't want to worry anymore about trying to sell its military deployment. It thinks it can just now openly sell it by being open about what it's doing, seizing control of natural resources, telling the governments in this region, your natural resources have to come to the US. You know, you have to gear all of your production, all of your extraction of any natural resource in order to fuel, some kind of development, some kind of industry in the United States. And that's the message now the government has decided that they're going to do, and they just kind of, don't really care about any fallout from that, and feel very confident, at least at this point in time, that they can get away with continuing to pursue that policy.
Now, of course, Donald Trump is his own unique individual, but policy-wise, I suppose maybe the media are making out that this is a more kind of unique thing than it is historically, in terms of invading oil-producing countries on some other pretense, or in fact in like meddling in the governments of Latin America, which the US has done a number of times. Do you see this as a new development, or is this a continuation of US foreign policy?
I think actually it's both. So it's definitely a continuation. And even if we just look at Venezuela, US administrations dating back to when Hugo Chavez was first elected in 1998, successive administrations since then have sought all different means to overthrow the Venezuelan government. First Hugo Chavez, and then Nicolas Maduro. That's included, supporting coups, backing right-wing opposition groups, provide armed mercenaries trying to enter the country to depose the government, and of course, perhaps most importantly in the last few years have been the dramatic, sanctions, which essentially actually operate as operating as a blockade on the economy in an attempt to kind of sort of strangle and suffocate the country into submission. So this has been from Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, and then Trump again. So there is a continuation, but I do think there are important differences as well. Prior to this, usually the US government has sought to disguise its actions, or to present its actions as not just naked interest of the US government, but as some kind of broad multilateral continental campaign in support of democracy. So quite often, for instance, a lot of the time, the United States would use things like the Organization of American States to bring together the governments of the region to try to condemn Venezuela, to give a kind of pretext of this was everyone against Venezuela, and always using the discourse of democracy. But Trump has put those to the side. Firstly, he's not interested in multilateralism. He's not interested in bringing together other governments to be part of this. He's decided, I'm going to do what I want for US interest, and then of course if you want to come along with me, all good, and if you don't, then you will pay the price. And the other thing is that he also made it clear that he's not interested in the question of democracy. And in fact, this has been a big part of the attack against Venezuela for some time now. But Trump's made it clear that he's got no interest in rushing towards, for instance, elections. Allow the Venezuelan people to decide who runs their government. In fact, he's quite happy with the current status quo, where the existing government is basically blackmailed, forced into submission, humiliated into signing a whole bunch of new contracts with US oil companies, essentially a neo-colonial agreements. And then once those are signed, maybe down the track the Venezuelans may have the right to have an election and to vote on who's their new president. But of course, by then all the deals would have been signed. Everything is already in track. So I think in that regards, there is definitely important differences in that complete disregard for international law, complete disregard for attempting to provide a multilateral framework or a discourse around democracy, and instead of just an open, brazen sort of focus on a public focus campaign on the fact that this is for American interests first.
Well, I am interested in knowing what does happen now for Venezuela. Obviously, there's been a sort of concerted political campaign against Maduro for a long time, which we will talk about more. But who is going to run Venezuela now?
Yeah, well, formally, who's running the government or who's running the country now is the acting president, Delcy Rodriguez. Delcy Rodriguez was the vice president until Maduro was kidnapped, and the Supreme Court the following day ruled that she would take the role of acting president. Obviously important in that sense of not allowing a vacuum to exist. So, on the surface, one can kind of say, well, I mean, what's really changed? Sure, it's not Maduro, but it's essentially his vice president who's in power. But I think if we try to understand what has happened in the last few days, we can start to grasp that actually something really fundamental has changed, and that is that while previously the government was, dependent on or was sustained, the Maduro government was sustained by the Venezuelan military, by economic elites that supported him in Venezuela, and by an important section of Venezuelan society, not a majority. Perhaps we can discuss that more in depth in later questions. But that was the base of support for the Maduro government. But today, the base of support for the Rodriguez government is the US military. Even though the US military is not there on the ground, there are not troops on the ground, the actions that the US government have done have essentially seized control of the government and sort of now put them in a position where, unless they are to abide by what the US sort of now tells them to do in the near future, that they can expect similar actions to occur to them. And so we're already seeing that play out. And of course, part of it is bluff and show in the media and stuff like that. So not all announcements can be taken seriously. But we do know for a fact, for instance, that PDVSA just today released a statement saying that it has already begun actually new negotiations with the United States for new oil contracts. And no one in their right mind can believe that somehow these negotiations are now happening on an equal footing at the negotiating table. When one side has just literally come in and kidnapped your president, you go into those negotiations in a very weak position. So I think that's the reality of where we're heading towards now. A very weak government who's propped up in many ways, or whose base is really the US government and the US military, who are holding it to ransom to tell them to say, look, you have to do what we tell you to do, and if you step out of line, you will pay the price. You will pay an even bigger price. In fact, Trump has said that you'll pay an even bigger price than the price that Maduro has happened. So I think, it is really dramatic what we've seen, in these last few days. It's essentially somewhat akin to a de facto protectorate that's the US has just set up. Something that's really hasn't been anything like that, since the colonial periods. I think that we'd have to go back to just kind of try to understand the very dangerous situation now in Venezuela.
Well, let's talk a bit beyond the last week and a bit about Venezuela and I guess the situation there. And I think you have to start with Hugo Chavez to understand, I guess, where the Maduro government comes from. And so can you tell us a bit about Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution, what it was?
Yeah, so as I said, look, the US has, basically, never looked favourably upon first the Chavez government and then the Maduro government. So if we start with Chavez, who is Chavez? Chavez essentially was someone who was part of the military in Venezuela, someone who basically through his life experience, both in terms of just seeing what was happening in the military, seeing what was happening in his country, and also through the fact that he had connections with the left wing movements. His brother was part of a left wing movement back in those times. Decided that it was necessary to enter into politics. Now he first enters into politics by trying to carry out a sort of a popular military rebellion in 1992, with the idea of linking that up with trade unions and others, community activists that would come out onto the streets to create a popular revolt. He's unable to succeed that way, and in fact, gets jailed, spends a few years in jail. But once, because of a popular campaign that ultimately releases him from jail, he decides that the road forward in order to be able to make change is to go to the ballot box, and so that's what he does. He essentially goes around, does a big popular campaign particularly in the poor neighbourhoods, asking people, saying, look, if I was to run for president, would you support me? And would you support the idea of, which was a key idea of his sort of politics, was a constituent assembly to rewrite a new constitution. He decided, well, the problem is that the rules of the game that are set up in the Venezuelan constitution benefit the rich, benefit oil companies, and they go against the interests of the poor. So what we need to do is a democratic process by firstly we elect a president, then through that process we go to a referendum to see if the people want to have a new constitution, and then we rewrite a new constitution by democratically electing representatives from all around the country to come together and discuss and debate that constitution. A process all of which occurs, and which a constitution is then ratified by a large majority of Venezuelan society. And so that sort of then starts to create a new framework, a new vision for the kind of Venezuela, a progressive vision that contains all sorts of important elements, everything from asserting sovereignty over oil and natural resources in Venezuela. Venezuela for a long time has been an oil-rich country, but that oil revenue has by and large benefited the oil companies and a very tiny elite. And the idea was, no, actually that this was not about excluding those elements, but that the oil wealth had to actually go towards not just dealing with the poverty, the historic debt that was owed to the poor people of Venezuela, but also using that resources to help empower communities. And so that was the second, I suppose, other important aspect of the Constitution, which was, democracy had to go beyond elections. Elections was fundamental. It was a key part of Chavez's project. No other government had more elections than the Chavez governments. Referendums, elections for basically everything. Recall referendums against Chavez. Almost every year there was an election in Venezuela. I think Venezuela broke records for the amount of elections that they had. So that was an important part of it, but understood that democracy had to go beyond just that people had to be able to take control of their everyday lives. And Chavez's motto was that if you want to get rid of poverty, you've got to genuinely give power to the people. Now, of course, these are the kind of ideas that no US administration supports, particularly in their backyard, and hence the big campaign that the US government immediately launches against Chavez, almost from day one, because it should be remembered that Chavez broke with the protocol because his first visit as president-elect was not to Washington, which is of course what every other president had done throughout history, but actually, if you want to really piss off the US, the place to go was what he did, which was to go to Cuba, to Havana, to meet with Fidel Castro. That already got the heckles up of the US administrations, and the situation will only worsen from there. But importantly, that process continues. We see the Chavez government increasingly assert sovereignty over its oil, using those oil rents to create missions to deal with issues of education and healthcare, and make rapid and important gains in terms of eradicating illiteracy, giving people access to basic healthcare that they previously didn't have, but also projects of popular power, of empowering people, be that through community councils where communities get together to discuss their issues and come up with solutions to them, through to even experiments in workers running factories and everything. So this is really what comes to become the heart and soul of what the Chavez finally decides. He gives it the label of 21st century socialism. So I think that's really, and that's the Chavez, that's the Venezuela that I knew, and that was the Venezuela when I was there, in 2007 to 2010, where, you could go to any neighborhood in any part of Venezuela, in the cities, in the countryside, and where people were discussing politics. They were discussing the constitutions, they were discussing their rights, they were discussing what the government was doing right, what the government was doing wrong, how the government could do better, but more importantly, how they needed to be part of pushing the government to make sure that those things were done better. Of course, as I said, such a radical experiment is, of course, an anathema to US governments, Democrats or Republicans alike.
For a while, it was the real hope of, I guess, the international socialist left, what was happening in Venezuela. Of course, there's always, imperfect, all these things. I guess, did it live up to the hype in the end, the Bolivarian revolution?
Well, so I think there's two things to say. So if we talk about the Chavez government, firstly, nothing ever really always lives up completely to the hype. But in fact, actually, Chavez himself was one of the first to be the biggest critics of how often the government would say one thing, but the reality, never quite matched that. And in fact, one of his most sort of important, famous speeches that even today people sort of still refer back to, or certainly at least people who support the legacy of Chavez, which is one of his last speeches before he passes away. He strongly criticises his own ministers for the fact that, whilst publicly they were promoting things like the communal councils and the communes as sort of local bodies of self-government, that the reality was that they were nowhere near what the government was talking about. So even he understood that there was weaknesses, that there was a discourse that was in advance of the reality that people were living, but he also acknowledged that there were important advances. And I think that, very few people, outside of those who have opposed Chavez from day one, but I think very few people look back negatively on the Chavez period. And in fact, for whatever it's worth, often, people carry out these types of polls, who would you vote for if an election was today? And when they include Chavez, who's obviously dead, can't run, but when they include his name, quite often he still wins out, because people remember that period of time. A period of time that also, must be said, benefited from very high oil prices, not the start of his period in government, but certainly in the later years, the government benefited from very high oil prices internationally that gave them more revenue to be able to carry out those projects.
Now, in 2013, after the illness and death of Hugo Chavez, Nicolas Maduro became the president, and theoretically he was the successor to Chavez's Bolivarian revolution. But in practice, it does seem that maybe the ideals of the revolution haven't quite continued in the same way.
I think it is true that since the Maduro government, there's been a move away from a lot of that, initial sort of positive, progressive politics that were being implemented, in experiments in sort of 21st century socialism that were occurring under the Chavez. And now there are a number of factors to that. I think it's way too simplistic to kind of envisage this as we just had a good Chavez and then a bad Maduro. I think we have to factor in all sorts of things, objective things, such as the decline in oil prices and the decline in oil production in Venezuela. We also absolutely have to factor in the US, essentially, a sort of a war without military troops on the ground that they carried out against the Venezuelan government. I've mentioned about, the use of mercenaries, the attempt to set up a parallel government, the attempt to the seizing of foreign assets of the Venezuelan government, the sanctions, the economic blockade, the blocking Venezuela out of accessing foreign bank loans. All of these things, worked as well to kind of economically strangle the country. I think the other factor we need to consider is also the actions of not the entirety, but certainly an important section of the right-wing opposition in Venezuela that has made clear that it was never wanting and never willing to accept the rules of the game, and always operated outside the rules of the game, always sought undemocratic means, precisely because they couldn't win elections. They did not have majority support, so they sought minority actions, violent street protests, military coups, these kind of activities to try to to constantly subvert and attempt to overthrow the Maduro government. These factors, plus I think the combination of internal factors that occur within the Maduro government that's having to deal with all this, it's having to deal with the loss of Chavez, the sudden death of Chavez, a sudden transition, a new election, all of a sudden a new president, I think starts the beginnings of a trajectory that really takes us towards what we have, up until the most recent period, a government that, more than being defined by those initial ideas of what Chavez fought for, is a government largely defined by wanting to maintain power at any at all costs. Now, as I said, part of that is because of the actions of the US government and of the opposition, who made it clear that should they ever lose power, these people would be jailed. They would be, if not worse, would come to them. And we're seeing that actually happening right now in case of Nicolas Maduro, in terms of, and hardly expect some kind of trial that is going to find him not guilty in US courts. That would be quite a turn of events if that was to happen. So that real danger, that in fact not just political danger, but danger to the physical integrity of some of the leaders of the government, certainly converted that sort of need, or that sense that of self-preservation meant holding on to power. But I think also as they progressively lost majority support, and that was demonstrated, for example, in 2015 when the opposition wins the National Assembly elections, that sort of really triggers a reaction within the government, which decides that it's too difficult actually to be able to maintain majority support from the population. So instead we have to seek ways that basically operate to minimise democratic rule in the country in order to ensure that we can stay in power. And I think that is also part of explaining, sort of how we get to where we are today. And in particular, for example, the fact that now 2 years ago, the 2024 presidential elections was a highly disputed elections. It was for the first time certainly since the Chavez-Maduro period of government, that the Venezuelan National Electoral Commission refused to publish results of the election. They simply published a total figure and said that Maduro had won. But even though legally they were bound to do this, and constitutionally bound to do this, even the Supreme Court ordered them to do this, even to this day, no verifiable results for those elections have been published, which, it gives a strong indication that certainly at the very minimum, that perhaps that the numbers that were announced perhaps don't correlate with the votes, and that perhaps even the outcome itself don't correlate with what people's attitudes were. So that's obviously, it's a complex process that happens, but in an attempt to explain it in broad brushstrokes, that's I think what we need to keep in mind, that factors that was outside of everyone's control, and then the deliberate actions of the US government, of sections of the right-wing opposition, and of the government itself, that in seeking to preserve its own sort of political life, essentially then turns towards what is ends up being quite an authoritarian project.
In a way, it's a sort of archetypal story of what starts as a populist movement kind of descends into paranoia and then sort of autocratic restriction of democratic freedoms. Was there another way that it could have gone, that the sort of revolution could have survived in a different form?
Well, look, the first thing I would say is that I would say it was more than just paranoia, because there was real threats to people's lives. So it wasn't just the idea that perhaps this could happen. It was without a doubt that this would happen, at certain periods of time, had the opposition, through their subversive actions, being successful in carrying out a military coup. So there was very, very real threats. I think there were alternatives. Those alternatives, of course, were extremely limited and restricted, and made ever more harder by the actions, particularly of the US government. And that's why, for instance, and of course, because none of anything that the Maduro government has done, or none of anything that the Venezuelan, even none of anything that anyone in Venezuela does, justifies or gives any right for the US to carry out the actions that it's done. So that's the first thing to say. It wouldn't matter if Venezuela was the most undemocratic, authoritarian, despotic sort of regime in the world, which it's far from being. There are many, many more worse regimes, and many of them have very friendly relationships with the US government. But even if that was the case, none of that would justify what the US has done for the last 2 decades, and what the US is doing now, which is only making the situation worse. And so, for instance, that's why many people inside and out Venezuela have always argued that the sanctions, far from helping the situation, worsen the situation, not just in the sense of economically for people in the country, but also worsen the situation because they were the perfect, people described it as the perfect tool, the perfect weapon that the government could use to basically justify anything and everything. Because that real threat that existed, that real limitation of their possibilities of what they could do, then became a blanket sort of excuse to be able to justify anything and everything. But I think having said all that, I think it is important to say that there were alternatives. There were alternatives that the government could have pursued in terms of economic policies that rather than seeking to strangle workers' wages, sought to lift workers' wages, to use that to boost domestic production. There are policies that the government could have done in terms of far from restricting democracy, as they did, from actively encouraging and working with other left-wing groups. That's an important aspect, that the government's repression, whilst generally justified and orientated towards the right-wing opposition, given that posed the biggest threat, at a certain point was then turned against left-wing, in many cases allies of the government, but the government felt that nothing outside of its sort of remit could be allowed, and so even the left then started to be persecuted. So I think there were alternatives. Of course, they were extremely limited. Maybe it would have ended up in the same situation. That's impossible to know. But I think there were choices made by the government. We can't just simply say that this all ends up where we are today, with the government completely with its hands tied behind the back and unable to have done anything differently. How the events would have unfolded, we don't know, but I think there are many examples of the way that, for instance, Chavez always had in the forefront of his mind the idea that we have to always take the people with us, and I think that was a key turning point in the thinking of the government. That once the government, when Chavez, for example, was in a situation where the polls indicated he had lost majority support, where the opposition went for a recall referendum to remove him from power, his response was to say, well, let's go to the referendum. Let's go to the people and let them decide. Even though we're starting from behind, we can overturn this if we get out there and politically convince people. Unfortunately, that same approach was not necessarily the one that the Maduro government followed, and I think that has to be noted. But I stress again, none of this in any way justifies what we've seen in the last few days or the last 10, 15 years of US foreign policy towards Venezuela.
Yes, well, over the last 10 years there has been a sort of escalating movement against Maduro and his government that's, I guess, started with sort of the capitalist right but has expanded more and more. But I assume that those people are not particularly happy with the turn of events that have just happened in this week, even though it is what they were hoping for. What do you think is the feeling in Venezuela now?
Yeah, so look, I think we've got to look at, I suppose there's a couple of different answers to this question. I think for the majority of Venezuelan society, many of whom feel completely disconnected from politics and the political class as a whole. So by that I mean disconnected from the government, but also from the opposition, that may have voted for the opposition in the last elections, but a vote that much more expressed its opposition to the existing government than an expression of a vote in favour of what the opposition represented. So I think for that majority of that population, it's sort of sitting back and expectant, it's not sure what's going to happen. It's not even sure what has happened. It's still trying to deal with this. And so, certainly from speaking to people, in Venezuela, that, the first day, the main concern was getting out to do some shopping because no one knew what the hell was going to happen for the next few days. So there was a bit of movement in that regards, but by and large, sort of, public life is only slowly getting back to normal. What's another reaction that we've seen? Well, certainly from the ongoing supporters of the current government, the United, in particular the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, the governing party, we've seen some important mobilisations from their supporters calling for the immediate release of Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores. On the first day, they were very small, 100, dozens, perhaps grown to thousands, and we can maybe even say some of the bigger rallies have gotten into the tens of thousands. But, that's sort of a demonstration that the government and the ruling party still have an important support base. It's not that no one supports the government, but it's far from expressing, a broader sort of societal sort of rebellion, against what's happened in the last few days. And then, of course, then we have the opposition who, I think are a bit unsure about how to deal with this situation. Many of them, in fact, have been calling for US military action and just assume they would be the immediate beneficiaries of any kind of such military action. But in fact, have by and large been sidelined for now. That may change at a later point, but I think many are sort of wondering, well, what is going to occur in the next period? And as I said, and this is based not just on the events of the last few days, but really the actions of the Trump administration last year. Trump's last interest in Venezuela is democracy. What he wants is an extremely weak transitional authority that is essentially beholden to him and his government, and it will do whatever they ask him to do in order to maintain power. And that's currently what we see happening at this point in time. Events may change. We may see a reaction, be that from the military, be that from the people. We have to see how all of this plays out. But by and large now, Trump has what he wants, so there's no need for him to include opposition figures in this transitional authority. And they've made clear that elections are for some time down the track. So I think there'll be some opposition people who certainly are wondering, well, what was all this worth it? All this calling for the military action worth it? And I'm sure that there'll be others that'll be sort of figuring out how they can basically best position themselves to be in that prime position if and when some kind of actual democratic elections happen in Venezuela, so that they can be the forerunners for the opposition.
Well, thanks very much, Federico. It's a lot to get through, and just finally, I guess there's so many different points of view for people to wade through if you're trying to figure out what is going on. If people are interested in hearing about Venezuela and the situation there, where do you recommend is the best place people look?
Yeah, well, look, obviously I'm biased. So, as I mentioned at the start, I write for Green Left, so I'd certainly put a plug in for Green Left, and I also edit the website Links International Journal of Socialist Renewal. So I think they're two pretty good sources of information. But beyond that, I suppose what I would encourage people to do is to read from a range of sources, because people's understanding of Venezuela, the politics in Venezuela has been so polarized for so long. All of these sites, have their particular bias, but I think also particularly sort of try to hunt out left-wing views from Venezuela, which are diverse. There's no one unified collective left-wing voice in Venezuela, progressive voice. You very pro-Maduro, very critical of Maduro, but still support and defend his government, through to those who essentially present themselves today as a left opposition. I think a lot of those people have a lot of interesting things to say, and often are left out in these sort of discussions where it's more about, well, here's what Delcy Rodriguez as the president is saying, here's what Trump's messaging out on Truth Social. I think, trying to see where you can find those voices is really important. Even I, as myself, I find that I need to read a diversity of things in English and in Spanish, but I certainly do try to seek out what sort of progressive activists in Venezuela are saying.
All right, well, thanks very much for chatting with us today, Federico.
Thank you.
That is Federico Fuentes there. We've been talking about Venezuela, both what has happened in the last week there with the US coup of that government and the abduction of President Nicolas Maduro. We've also been talking a bit about the history of Venezuela, of the social movement, and I guess what's happened since then. And so hopefully you feel a bit more well-informed on this issue. What can we do to show solidarity with the people of Venezuela? Well, I think there's plenty of things, hopefully starting out with being informed, but it's a long slog, and power is the name of the game sometimes in world politics, and this is ultimately what we've seen is just a brazen act of power by the US empire, and yeah, it's going to be a lot of work for those of us who believe in equality and freedom and more just ways of doing society to try to do that in the face of big, powerful empires who are not afraid to use their military power. Anyway, we'll be back on the Paradigm Shift next week to keep on talking about different ways of seeing and doing. See you next week.